The Little Princess of Tower Hill, Chapter 5, The Empty Hutch. At breakfast that morning, Lady Ascot noticed how tired Maggie looked. Her blue eyes were swollen as if she had been crying. Her pretty cheeks were very red, and she did not come to the table with all of her usual appetite. Maggie always breakfasted with her father and mother, and she also had her early dinner at their lunch. But her own lunch and tea she took in the schoolroom with Miss Grey. Miss Grey was now present at the breakfast table, and so was Ralph. Ralph was a very slight and thin boy with dark face and bright eyes. He looked uncommonly well this morning, remarkably neat in his person, and altogether a striking contrast to the poor disheveled little Maggie. Maggie felt afraid to raise her eyes from her plate. When her mother noticed the fatigue, she knew that Ralph's quizzical and laughing gaze was upon her, and that his lips were softly moving to the inaudible words, "Little muff, she got up in the middle of the night. She got up in the middle of the night." Maggie would have been quite saucy enough and independent enough to be indifferent to these remarks of Ralph's, and perhaps even to pay him back in his own coin, but for the loss of the rabbits. Bianco and Lily were gone, however. The hutch was empty, and it was all the little princess's fault, and in consequence her versatile spirits had gone down to zero. With all her faults, and she had plenty, Maggie was far too honest a child to think of concealing what she had done from her cousin. She meant to tell him, but she had dread very much going through her revelation, and she felt that his contempt and anger would be very bitter and hard to bear. Maggie always sat next to her father at breakfast, and he now patted her on her hot cheeks, and looked tenderly at her, and piled the choicest morsels on her plate. "The little maid does not look quite the thing," Sir John called across the table to his wife. "I think we must give her a holiday. Miss Grey, you won't object to a holiday, I'm sure, and Ralph and Maggie will have plenty to do with each other." "If you please, sir," burst out Ralph. "Do you mind coming round with me after breakfast and seeing the accommodations for the rabbits and the pigeons? I think my rabbits want a larger and better hutch. If you please, Uncle John." "All right, my boy, we'll see about them," replied the good-natured uncle. "Hullo, little maid, what is up with you? Where are you off to?" I don't want any breakfast. I'm tired," said Maggie, and before her father could again interrupt her, she ran out of the room. Her heart was full. There was a limit to her endurance, and she could not go with Sir John and her cousin Ralph to look at that empty hutch. She wondered what she should do. She wished with all her heart at this moment that Ralph had never come, and that he had never brought these tiresome and beautiful rabbits to tempt her to open the door of their prison, and so unwittingly set them free. She ran once more into the garden, and went in forlorn manner into the shrubbery. She had a kind of wild vain hope that Bianco and Lily might be tired of having run away, and might have returned to their new home. She approached the rabbit hutch. Alas, the truants were nowhere in sight, and she stooped down and looked into the empty home, and just at this moment a voice was heard approaching, the clear high voice of her boy cousin, accompanied by Sir John's deeper tones. Maggie had nothing for it but to hide, and the nearest and safest way for her to accomplish this feat was to climb into a large tree, which partly overshadowed the rabbit hutch. Maggie could climb like any little squirrel, and Sir John and Ralph took no notice of a rustling in the boughs as they approached. Her heart beat fast. She crouched down in the green leafy foliage, and looked and trusted they would not look up. There was certainly no chance of their doing that. When Ralph discovered that his pets were gone, he gave vent of something between a howl and a cry of agony, and then, dragging his uncle by the arm, they both set off in vain search for the missing pets, Bianco and Lily. No one knew better than poor Maggie did How slight was their chance of finding them. She wondered if she might leave her leafy prison, if she would have time to rush in to nurse or mother before Ralph came back. She thought she might try. It would be such a comfort to put her head on her mother's shoulder and tell her the story, to sympathize with her. She would just make the first rustle in the old tree, preparatory to her descent, when Sir John's portly form was seen returning. He was coming back alone, and after a fashion was saying aloud, "Very strange occurrence, 'pon my word, quite mysterious. Whoever did open the door of the hatch? Surely Jim would not be so mischievous. I must question him, and if I think the young rascal is telling me a lie, he shall go. Yes, he shall go. I won't be humbugged. And Ralph, poor lad, it's a disgrace to have my sister's son annoyed in this way on the very first morning of his visit. Why, hello, Maggie, little woman, what are you doing up there?" "I'm coming down. If you'll just wait a minute, father," called down Maggie. "Oh, please, father, stand up close under the tree, and don't let Ralph see us. I'm coming down as hard as ever I can. There, please stretch up your hand, father. When I catch it, I'll jump." "Into my arms," said Sir John, holding her tight in a loving embrace. "My darling, you are not well. You're all trembling. What's the matter, little woman?" "Nothing, father, only I wanted to speak to you so badly, and I didn't want Ralph to hear. I heard you say that perhaps Jim did it, and you'd send him away. 'Twasn't Jim, 'twas me. I'm miserable about it. 'Twas all me, father." "All you? Maggie, what do you mean?" "I let them out, father. I gave poor Bianco and Lily some nice lettuce leaves just here under the tree. See, they have not quite finished what I gave them. While they were feeding, I thought I'd clean the hutch to please Ralph, and I ran round to the hay rack for some fresh hay, and when I came back Bianco and Lily were gone, and I spent all the time before breakfast looking for them, but I couldn't see them anywhere. Poor Jim had nothing to do with it, father. I did see Jim this morning. I think he's an awfully good boy. Father, Jim had nothing to do with opening the door of the hutch. It was all me." "Yes, Maggie, so it seems. Ah, here comes Ralph himself. Now, my dear little maid, you really need not be frightened. I'll undertake to break the tidings to Master Ralph. You were a good child to tell me." "I can't find them anywhere, uncle," called back Ralph in his high voice. "Who could have been the mischievous person to let them out? Don't you think it was very wicked, Uncle John, for anyone to open my hutch door? I expect some thief came and stole them. I suppose you are magistrate, Uncle John. I hope you are, and that you have a warrant issued immediately, so that the person who stole my Bianco and Lily may find themselves locked in prison. Why, if that is not Maggie standing behind you, how very odd! Why are you there, Maggie?" Sir John laid his hand on Ralph's shoulder. "The fact is, my lad," he said, "this poor dear little person here has come to me with a little confession. It seems that she is guilty. She gave your rabbits something to eat, and let them out in order that they might enjoy their meal better, and then it occurred to her to get some fresh hay for the hutch, and while she was away, the rabbits took it into their heads to play truant. You must forgive Maggie, Ralph. She meant no harm. If the rabbits are not found, I can only promise to get you another pair." While his uncle was speaking, Ralph's face had grown very white. "I don't want any other rabbits, thank you, Uncle John," he said. "It was poor little Joe gave me Bianco and Lily. I was fond of them. Other rabbits would not be the same. I only hope, Ralph, your pets will be found. I shall send a couple of men to search for them directly. In the meantime, you must promise me not to be angry with my poor little girl. She meant no harm." "Oh, I'm not angry," said Ralph. Most girls are muffs. Jo isn't, but then she's not like other people." He turned on his heels and sauntered slowly away. It is difficult to say how the affair of the rabbits would have terminated, and how soon Maggie would have been taken back into Ralph's favor, but just then, on the afternoon of that very day, in fact, an event occurred which turned everyone's thoughts into a fresh channel. Lady Ascot received a telegram announcing the dangerous illness of her favorite and only sister. It was necessary that she and Sir John should start that very night for the north to see the person in question. What was to become of the two children? "Send us to mother, of course," promptly said Ralph. "Hullo!" exclaimed Sir John. "Why, I declare, if it isn't a good thought. Violet wouldn't mind having you both to visit for a fortnight or so, and Miss Grey would go with you, so that your mother need have no extra trouble. Remember, Ralph, you are bound to us for the summer, my boy, and we only lend you to your mother for a few days. You quite understand?" "Lend me to mother? No, I'm sure I don't understand that," said Ralph. "Oh, Maggie," he exclaimed suddenly, in all his old brightest manner, "if we go to London, you'll see Jo." "I'll go off this very moment and telegraph to my sister," said Sir John, "and the children and Miss Grey can start tomorrow morning. It's all arranged. It is a splendid plan." In 5 minutes the plan was made, which was to exercise so large an influence over little Maggie, which was, in short, completely to alter her life. Sir John sent off his telegram, and in the course of the afternoon his sister, Mrs. Granville, replied to it, and she would be ready to receive Ralph and Maggie the next day, and would be pleased also to have Miss Grey, Maggie's governess, accompany the children. Maggie had never seen London, and Ralph became eloquent with regard to its charms. "It will be delightful for you," he said. "Of course, I'm rather tired of it all, for I have been everywhere and seen everything, all the sights. But it will be really very nice for you. You are young, you know, Maggie, and you'll have to go to the places where quite little children are seen. Madame Trussard's is one, and the Zoological Gardens is another. Oh, won't it be fun to see you jumping when the lion roars?" At these words of Ralph's, Maggie turned rather pale, and perceiving that he had made an impression, he proceeded still further to work on her feelings, describing graphically the scenes at the zoo, when the lions are fed, the cruel glitter in the eyes of the hungry beasts, and the awful sounds which they made when they crushed the great bones of meat provided for them. "You mustn't go too near their cages," said Ralph. "Nobody knows how strong a lion is, and though the cages are made with very large bars of iron, used still—" Here Ralph made an expressive pause. Maggie opened her blue eyes, remained quite silent for a moment, for she did not wish Ralph to suppose that she was really afraid of the lions, and then she said softly, "I'm not going to the zoo at all. Not at first. I'm going to do my lessons with Miss Grey in the house when the lions are fed. I know it's very good of me, but I am going to be good, 'cause I am so sorry about your rabbits, Ralph." "So you ought to be," said Ralph, turning red. "But weeks and weeks of being sorry won't bring them back, when people do very careless and thoughtless things. Being sorry doesn't mend matters. You ask Mother. She'll explain it to you. But please, don't say anything more about Bianca and Lily. I want to know what you mean by saying that you'll do your lessons at the hour the lions are fed." "You do your lessons at the hour that most suits Miss Grey, don't you?" Maggie nodded. "Yes," she said. "I'm going to please poor Miss Grey, too. I'm going to be very good." "Well, Miss Grey won't like to be kept at home in the afternoons teaching you your lessons. She'll like to be out amusing herself in the afternoon." I'll call that more thoughtful. You'll have to do your lessons in the morning, and the lions are fed at 3 o'clock, so that excuse won't serve. I'm not going to the zoo, continued Maggie, who began to feel decidedly worried. If Miss Gray wants to be out in the afternoon, I'll go to Madame Trussard's then. I don't like the zoo, and I'm not fond of lions, but I expect Madame Trussard's must be nice sort of place. Oh, Ralph began to jump about on one leg. You see the Chamber of Horrors before you make up your mind whether it's nice sort of place or not. I won't go, said Maggie. I need not go unless I like. And then she walked out of the room, beginning seriously to debate in her poor little mind on the joys of having a playmate, for Ralph contrived a very turn to make her feel so very small. Chapter 6. Joe's Room. It was well for Maggie that Ralph was a very different boy when he was around his mother. When the children arrived in London and found themselves at Mrs. Greenville's pretty bright house in Bayswater, Ralph flew to his sweet-looking young mother, who came up to meet them, clasped his arms round her neck, laid his head on her shoulder, and instantly a softening and sweet expression came over his dark and somewhat hard little face. Mrs. Greenville was very much like her brother, so that prevented Maggie being shy with her. She also petted the little girl a great deal, and as a matter of course took more notice of her than of Ralph. Mrs. Greenville also spoke about the zoo and Madame Tussauds, but she contrived to make them two places of entertainment sound quite delightful to her little visitor. Instead of dwelling on their horrors, she spoke of their manifold and varied charms, until Maggie's eyes sparkled, and she said, in her quick, excitable way, I'll go there with you, Aunt Violet. I'd like to go to both of those places with you. Aunt Violet read between the lines here, and gave Ralph a quick little glance, which he pretended not to see. The next morning Mrs. Greenville asked Miss Gray to allow Maggie to have a holiday. Tomorrow she will begin her lessons regularly, continued the lady. Of course, by this time, such a tall girl can read and write nicely, and I shall like to enclose a little letter from her to her mother. But today the children and I mean to be very busy together. Ralph, as you are older, and as you know most about London, you shall choose what our amusement shall be. Maggie felt herself turning first red and then white when Mrs. Greenville spoke of her reading and writing accomplishments, but Miss Gray was merciful and made no comment, and as Ralph had not been made acquainted with the poor little princess' profound ignorance, she trusted that her secret was safe. Mother, here eagerly burst in Ralph. Of course, the very first thing we must do is to go and see Joe. Shall I go round to see Joe this morning? And may I take Maggie with me? I think it would do Maggie a lot of good to see a girl like Joe. Joe would do any one good, responded Mrs. Greenville. It is a kind thought, Ralph, and you may carry it out. If you and Maggie like to run upstairs and get ready now, I will send Waters round with you, and I will call for you myself at Filmer's building at 12 o'clock after all. I should like to take Maggie myself to the zoo. I want her to see the monkeys and the birds, and she shall have a ride on one of the elephants if she likes. As for the lions, dear, continued Mrs. Greenville, looking kindly at the little girl, you shall not see them fed unless you like. I don't mind seeing them fed, if you are with me, whispered back Maggie, but just then Ralph called to her imperiously, and she had to hurry out of the room. Aren't you glad you are going at last to see my dear little Joe? Exclaimed the boy. Now do hurry, Mag. Get yourself up nice and smart, for Joe does so admire pretty things. Maggie made no response, but went slowly into her little bedroom. In her heart of hearts, she was becoming intensely jealous of this wonderful Jo. She was putting her in the same category with those unpleasant little girls who liked needlework and were exceedingly proper and good, and belonged to that tiresome class of little models of whom the nurse was so fond of speaking. Maggie had borne patiently all of Ralph's rhapsodies over the perfect little Jo, but quite a pang went through her heart when she heard that Mrs. Greenville also praised her. "I don't want to go," she said to Miss Gray, helping her on with her boots, and took on her neat little jacket and pretty shady hat from the drawer. "Not want to go?" said the governess. "Oh, surely you will like the walk with Ralph this morning." "No, I won't," said Maggie, "and I don't want to see Jo. I'm sure she's a horrid good little girl, and she's like nurse's Sunday go-to-meeting girls, and I'll never could bear them." Miss Gray could not help smiling slightly at Maggie's eager words. "I remember," she said, after a pause, as she helped to put the little girl's sash straight, "when I was a child about your age, Maggie, I often amused myself making up pictures of people before I had met them. I generally found that the pictures were wrong, and that the people were not at all like what I had manufactured in my mind." Maggie pondered over the statement, and then she said solemnly, "But I know about Jo. I'm quite sure that my picture of Jo isn't wrong. She wears a white pinafore, and there are no spots on it, and her hair is so shiny. I expect there are Vaseline in her hair, and her nails are neat, and her shoes are always buttoned, and, oh, she's a horridly good little girl, and I don't like her, and I never will like her." "Maggie, Maggie!" shouted Ralph from below, and Maggie, with a nod at Miss Gray and the parted words, "I know all about her," rushed out of the room, dancing down the stairs and holding her cousin's hand, and accompanied by the sedate Waters, set out on their morning walk. It was Maggie's first walk in London, and the children and maid soon found themselves crossing Hyde Park, coming out at one of the gates at the opposite side from Mrs. Greenville's pretty house, and then entering a crowded thoroughfare. Here Waters stepped resolutely between the little pair, took a hand of each, and hurried them along. Ralph carried a small closed basket in his hand, and Maggie wondered what it contained, and why Ralph looked so grave and thoughtful, and why he so often questioned Waters as to the contents of the square box, which she also carried. "You took great care of that box while I was away, Waters." "Well, yes, Master Ralph. It always stood on the mantelpiece and in my mistress's room, and I dusted it myself most regularly." "And do you really think it's getting heavy, Waters?" "Well, sir, you're away exactly 2 nights and 2 days, and that means, by the allowance of 1 penny a day given to you, 2 pennies more in the money-box. It's 2 pennies heavier than it was, sir, when you left us. And that's all." Ralph sighed profoundly. "Time goes very slowly," he said. "How I wish I had more money, and when I had it, I hadn't spent it so fast. Well, perhaps Jo has managed about the tambourine after all. If it is a good manager, Jo is one. Oh, here we are at last." The children and Waters had turned into a shabby-looking street, and were now standing before a block of buildings which looked new and tolerably clean. Unlike any ordinary house Maggie had ever seen, this one appeared to possess no hall door, but was entered at once by a flight of stone stairs. The children and the servants began to ascend the stairs, and Maggie wondered how many they would have to go up before they reached the rooms where the little girl in the spotless pinafore with the white hands and the smooth Vaseline hair resided. Maggie was rather puzzled and disconcerted by the bare look of the stone stairs, and also by the somewhat anxious and grave expression on Ralph's face. She was unacquainted with that kind of look, and it puzzled her, and she began dimly to wonder if Miss Grey was right, and her picture of Joe was untrue. At last they stopped at a door, which was shut, and which contained some writing in large black letters on its yellow paint. Maggie could not read, but Ralph pointed to the letters and said joyfully, "Here we are at last." The words on the door were these: Mrs. Aylmer, laundress and charwoman. But Maggie, of course, was not enlightened by what she could not understand. Waters knocked at the door, and a quick, eager little voice said, "Come in," and there was the pattering of some small feet. The door was flung wide open, and Maggie, Ralph, and Waters found themselves inside Joe's room. That was the first impression the room gave. It seemed to belong to Joe. Joe's spirit seemed to pervade it all over. Mrs. Aylmer, laundress and charwoman, might own the room and pay the rent for it, but that made no difference. It was Joe's. Who was Joe? Maggie asked herself this question. Then she turned red, and then she felt her lips trembling. Then she became silent, absorbed, fascinated. The picture she had conjured up faded never to return, and the real Joe took its place. Joe was the most beautiful little girl Maggie had ever seen. She had fluffy, shining, tangled hair. Her pale face was not thin, but round and smooth. Each little feature was delicate and chiseled. The lips were little rosebuds. The eyes had that serene light which you never see except in the face of those children who have been taught patience through suffering. Joe was sadly a crippled little girl, laying on a low bed. Maggie, of course, had seen her poor children in the village at home, but those children had not been ill, and they were rosy and hearty and strong. This child looked fragile, and yet there was nothing absolutely weak about her. At that moment, when Ralph and Maggie entered, Joe was keeping school. 2 twin boys were standing by her bedside and listening eagerly to her instructions. "No, no, Bob," she was saying. "You mustn't do it that way. You must do it more carefully, Bob, and slower. Now, shall we begin again?" Bob tried to drone something in a monotonous sing-song, but just then the visitors' faces appeared, and all the semblance of school vanished on the spot. Ralph poured out a whole string of remarks. The contents of the money-box was emptied on Joe's bed, and the excited questions of Susie's tambourine came under earnest discussion. If Susie had a proper tambourine, she could use her rather sweet voice to advantage and earn money by singing and dancing in the streets. Susie was 10 years old, the thick-set little girl with none of Joe's transparent beauty. 6 pence had been already collected for the coveted musical instrument. Ralph's box contained 8 pence, but alas, the tambourine on which Susie had set her heart could not be obtained for a smaller sum than half a crown. "You're not worth nothing for less than that," she exclaimed. "They make no sound, and when you sings or dance with them, your voice don't seem to carry nohow. No, I'd a sight rather wait and have a good one. Them cheap uns crack too when they gets wet. Here's 6 pence, and here's 8 pence, and that makes 1 shilling and 2 pennies. Oh, but it do seem as if it were a long way off to see our way to a full crown." Here Susie, whose face had been radiant, became suddenly depressed, and Maggie felt a lump in her throat, and an earnest, almost passionate wish to get hold of her father's purse strings. "Now come and talk to Joe," said Ralph, drawing his little cousin forward. "We need not say any more about the tambourine today. I'm saving up all my money. I earn a penny every day that I'm good, and I'll give you my pennies to Susie for the present. So she'll really have the half-crown by and by. Now, Joe, this is my cousin Maggie, and I've told her about you. She lives down in the country, and she doesn't know much, but then that's not to be wondered at. She was very naughty and careless, too, about my rabbits. She has asked me to forgive her, of course, and I haven't said much. It wouldn't be at all manly to scold a girl. But you are really the one to forgive her, Joe, for the rabbits were yours before they were mine." "What, Bianco and Lily?" answered Joe, the pink color coming into her little face. "Oh, Missy, weren't they beautiful and white?" "Yes, and they're lost," said Maggie. "It was I who did it. I opened the door of their little house, and they ran out and went into the woods, and none of us could find them since. Ralph said it was you gave them to him, and he doesn't really and truly forgive me, though he pretends he does. I was sorry, but I won't go on being sorry if he doesn't really and truly forgive me." To this rather defiant little speech of Maggie's, Joe made a very eager reply. She looked into the pretty little country lady's face, right straight up into her eyes, and then she said, ecstatically, "Oh, ain't I happy to think as my beautiful darling white Bianco and Lily has got safe away into a real country wood. Oh, Missy, are there real trees there and grass? And is there a little stream?" "Yes, there is," said Maggie, "a sweet little stream, and it tinkles away all day and all night, and of course there are trees, and there's grass, and it's just like any other country wood." "I'm so glad," said Joe. "I can picture it. Of course, I has never seen it, but I can picture it. Trees, grass, and little streams a-tinkling, and the white bunnies ever and ever so happy. Yes, Missy. Thank you, Missy. It's real beautiful. And when I shuts my eyes, I can see it all." Joe had said nothing about forgiving Maggie. On the contrary, she seemed to think her careless deed something rather heroic. Ralph raised his dark eyebrows, fidgeted a little, and began to look at his cousin with a new respect. At this moment, Mrs. Greenville's footman came up to say that the carriage was waiting for the children, so Maggie's first visit to Joe was over.